Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by AutoSlash. AutoSlash may be the best way to find the lowest possible rate when you rent a car. They'll help you find the best rate and then will continue to look for an even better rate in case it goes down. Autoslash.com.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 617. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about endangered species and ecosystems, Art Deco and Cuban influence, coral quarries, and Civil War forts as we go to southern Florida. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I've been dying to tell you this tale. In part, it's about some of my travels in May, although I have someone helping me talk about southern Florida, and we've got a lot to say, so let's get started. I'd like to welcome back to the show my friend Erik Smith, who has been on the show, we think, 6 times, and this is his 7th, and he's come to talk to us this time about southern Florida. Erik, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Chris, it's good to be back.
I don't remember all 6 times that you've been on the show before. I know we've done a show a long time ago about the national parks. We did a show about Amsterdam, the Four Corners,
Yellowstone, South Island of New Zealand, Michigan. I'm sure we're missing something else in there, but yeah, those were the ones.
There we go. But we're going to talk about South Florida this time. Where are we going to talk about?
Well, I kind of broke it down in 3 areas. We talk about a little bit about Miami because that's generally where you're going to. If you're flying in, that's generally where you're going to start your trip at. 2 other areas is the amazing ecosystem of Everglades National Park, and then also the long string of islands that extends south of the Florida Peninsula, known as the Florida Keys.
Excellent. And I have not been to the Everglades, but I was recently both in the Keys and Miami. But this is one of those things that I wanted somebody else who knew more about them or had a little more experience with this area of Florida to talk about them with me, because I don't like to talk to myself.
Well, I mean, we all like to talk to ourselves a little. Come on, we're travelers. So.
just a bit.
So you were starting us in Miami, and Miami is one of the two natural starting places for this trip. In my case, I flew down, or I drove down rather, from Orlando as one of those people who was there for theme parks. In my case, the work I'm doing with Universal this year. But what would you recommend we do in Miami?
Well, honestly, Miami is one of those places where it's got this larger than life reputation. You hear about South Beach and all the celebrities that live there and the beautiful people, and Miami Beach is famous for that as well. And then, of course, the most famous neighborhood in Miami is Little Havana, which is every bit as good as you think. And when I first went to Miami back in 2003, I didn't feel incredibly comfortable and enjoy Little Havana very much. And on a recent trip, I enjoyed it a lot more. So, I mean, Miami's one of these bigger than life cities with all that reputation. Some of it deserved, some of it probably blown up by the media.
I think the last time I had been in Miami was before my son was born, the summer before my son was born. I know he turned 30 this year, so it had been a little while. I had stayed for a conference in the Fontainebleau, the big iconic hotel there on Miami Beach that dates back to I want to say the 50s. Actually, it's a lot of the downtown Miami, or the downtown in Miami Beach, is in response to a lot of the business moving out to shops in that new hotel that opened up.
Sure.
So when they opened up that hotel, it stole a lot of the business from Lincoln Avenue in that area, or Lincoln Street.
Yeah, so home of a lot of that Art Deco that the Fontainebleau is right near the beginning of most of the Art Deco tours out on the Miami Beach section as well.
Well, and what they did then is they turned that downtown section of Miami Beach into one of the first pedestrian streets in the U.S., one of the first pedestrian malls, in response to losing the business down to Fontainebleau. And so that's still one of the things that, if you're in Miami Beach, is a heart of that particular neighborhood, is that pedestrian mall with the high-end shops.
Well, let's go with the tip right away for Miami Beach and South Beach, which we'll probably get back to. Use public transportation or Uber or Lyft, because the parking in both places, it's on one of these keys that is a natural barrier to the ocean, and it's a thin stretch of land, and they have really done their fair share of building on it. So parking is a premium, and it's also difficult to find, and having a car down there on your own is, both of those areas is more trouble than it's probably worth.
Well, the other thing, too, is in the South Beach area now there are free shuttles that go up and down South Beach, so it's very easy to get around. And then also I got to my hotel, which was at the northern end of the big area in South Beach, just almost straight across from where you come across from the mainland. And there's a bus that goes directly from there to the Miami airport. Basically, Miami airport, you get off and there's a transit center that connects to buses and trains right from the airport, which I always find so convenient when places do that. And it was very easy to get downtown. It was pretty cheap. I don't remember how much it was, but it was $10 or something like that to get down to South Beach. The bus that basically drove all the way there and then made stops. And so, yeah, definitely agree with that. The other thing I would say is I did a guided tour, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. And a guide said, yeah, they don't drive like America here on South Beach. You have to get, and I don't remember what street he said, further north, he said, before the driving looks like the U.S. again.
Yeah, that was my experience. I didn't know down and drove Ocean Drive because I had my car with me and I was on that kind of tour. And that was the least enjoyable part, was driving out there. I know that had I just been smarter about it when I did my boat tour from Miami's downtown area on the mainland, I could have easily gotten a shuttle to either place. Very, very easy there too. And like I said, I don't remember the exact cost, like the same as you, but it was not outrageous in any way. And a lot of this area is expensive. We talk about the Keys, we're going to talk about expense. But I thought the public transportation and the shuttle systems in Miami certainly were well worth the money, and as opposed to the headache. So that's certainly something you want to look into.
Recommendations for things to do and see in Miami.
I start with Little Havana because I think the next generation is going to be able to travel to Cuba a little more freely than us, but it is a nice slice of Cuba in the U.S., and it's certainly, there are things you can do there that are extremely touristy. For example, the cigar rolling demonstration that I saw was made just for the tourists, but it's something cool, and it's something, when you think of Cuba, something like sort of iconic that you do there. And we also went and did 2 different nights worth of Cuban music. One was very touristy. One was a place that had been recommended the night before to get away and not do such a touristy thing. The Little Havana is full of, and I don't have one to recommend because I didn't do one in particular, but culinary tours are a huge thing in the Little Havana area. And I would recommend getting out there because in most big cities, there are lots of Cuban delis popping up. We have a couple here in the Detroit area that have popped up as a popular type of cuisine. So it's a good place to walk around. Like I say, in 2003, it felt a little bit more gritty. And now it's, I think on the other way, it feels a little bit too touristy, but still it's the absolute best area in Miami I visited, and certainly the most fascinating. They have the Calle Ocho Walk of Fame, which talks about famous Cubans and
famous Latin American stars, not all Cubans, but yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Gloria Estefan, and then the boxer Roberto Duran, Mario Conchito Alonso, and then a lot of names I didn't recognize.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was all Cuban Americans. Okay. The other thing that I really enjoyed there, and this was going back over 10 years, the Brigade 2506 Museum was down. That's basically the Bay of Pigs Museum, but that has moved further north into one of Miami's northern suburbs. I found that out today when researching it, trying to figure out where exactly it was. So that was too bad because it was a very small museum and in a very beat-up building, but they've expanded to bigger digs up in Hialeah, which is north of Miami. But that was a fascinating part of Little Havana when I was down there.
I also like the street art around Calle Ocho. Great big colorful murals on the buildings that you can either do a tour of, I'm sure, but even just walking around and taking pictures of them were fun.
Well, and one thing I saw when I was sort of trying to research the area is I saw that you can do a workshop in how to create that type of street art. There's a company that offers a workshop on that down there, which to me, that sounds fascinating. Next time I'm in Miami, I'm totally looking that up. That would be a really cool thing to do, just sort of get an idea of what goes into that very specific type of artwork.
And I have a tour that I could recommend for Little Havana, but I didn't take it. This is an odd thing. So I had a tour that I took in South Beach that was a food and art deco tour. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes in terms of who I took that from. I found it on Viator, which is usually what I do for finding some of those. In fact, there's an amateur traveler version of Viator, branded if you go to amateurtraveler.com/tours, but I often look through them for the local person who is offering a tour, and found a great tour of South Beach, and I've got a blog post up on it in terms of the 5 different restaurants that we went to and what we ate, and then also some of the Art Deco architecture that we saw there, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But he also does a tour of Little Italy. I just didn't have time to do that when I was there. I think he didn't have one the next day that I was in town, but I would definitely recommend who I went with, and so I'll put a link to in the show notes to his tour. I think that was the Food Tours in Miami is the brand. But I would love to do a food tour in Little Havana, because this is somebody who isn't Cuban, didn't grow up in Miami, but has lived there for enough time and knew enough people that he really found the little tiny place around the corner that you wouldn't have found. And that's what you're looking for in a food tour, right? You're looking for Mama still makes the pork the way that she did it in the homeland and those sort of things. So I would definitely recommend food tours in Miami as a good vendor, and I know they do a tour of Little Havana.
I wound up, back when I was less of a seasoned traveler, I wound up at a place called Versailles, which is one of the more famous Cuban restaurants down there. And I agree with you that the best place to find authenticity in the real experience is by finding the smaller, more local places. This place is extremely famous. It's probably the most famous in Little Havana for getting Cuban cuisine. And we really enjoyed ourselves. This was more than 10 years ago, but we did enjoy ourselves there. We thought the service was excellent. But it's one of those things where if I went back, I would probably do what you do. And I agree with you. I found all over the world. You find, if you research tours, the first one that pops up on Google that you're looking for is probably not the one you're looking for. You probably need to buy it or a site like that where you go, where you find the more local-based tours. Mm-hmm. And those often provide a much more in-depth and less homogenized view of the area you're trying to get into.
Let's take a break here and hear from our sponsor. Again, the sponsor of this episode is AutoSlash. AutoSlash is going to help you find a rental car at a good price by not only searching across different rental car companies, but also searching for different discounts that would be available through AAA, Costco, AARP, credit cards, frequent flyer programs, and all those things. They're going to check literally hundreds of coupons and discount codes, which I don't know about you, but I don't have time to do that myself. And then after it helps you find the best available rate, it's going to continue to look for price drops and better deals. If it finds a lower rate, then it will email you so you can take advantage of the savings. It's like price protection for your rental. It's almost like having an assistant who is fully dedicated to finding you the best deal on a rental car. I have not used it personally, but I have a friend who has and had a good experience. They say that renters on average save 30% or more using AutoSlash. Check them out. Autoslash.com. Okay. Do we want to say anything else about Little Havana before we move on?
Not really. I was going to move on to, you talked about Miami Beach and South Beach. Kind of cover them together, even though they're not the same. South Beach is more the party scene, I would say. And like we say, that's the one famous for the rich and famous. And the night is famous for its nightlife. If you're going out to the beaches on South Beach, make sure you know which beach you're going to, because they do have nude beaches out there and you don't want to be on the wrong beach. So I had a friend who had an experience with that last year who thought, well, South Beach is probably all the same, and wound up on the beach that they didn't really want to be on. So you want to make sure you double check out there. Again, South Beach is really the party scene. It's known for its nightlife, the clubs, the live music, the outdoor, the walking from bar to bar with your drinks and stuff. And that's really a scene. That's not really my scene, but I know a lot of people who, and South Beach is also a very expensive place to stay as well. Miami Beach is a little less expensive. Miami Beach is a little more cultured in that it's got the Art Deco tours that you talked about. For me, I just downloaded a tour from a blogger that I trusted, and it gave me I had a couple hours to walk around, and it gave me the 10 Art Deco buildings you really want to see. And so I went out and did my Art Deco stuff, and I was able to stop by the extremely moving Holocaust Memorial, which is out there. And I was generally pretty pleased with that part of the Miami Beach experience. So,
and can you send me a link to that self-guided tour, and I'll put that in the show notes?
I will. I have a blog post somewhere in my very underwritten blog somewhere about this, so I will look for it. Yeah, it was very good, and it was one of those ones where you just don't expect. Art Deco for me is, I saw a lot of it in Tel Aviv on a trip I took, inspired by The Amateur Traveler.
You always get points for saying that. Well, and that's a little different from Art Deco. That's closer to the Bauhaus school of architecture, a little earlier than Art Deco. The white buildings of Tel Aviv, but similar. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely related.
Similar styles. So I'd rate one right after the other. Well, honestly, both styles. As you have, I've traveled to other parts of Europe, and I like the big old Gothic buildings.
I'm an Art Deco sucker.
Ah, okay.
And one of the best examples that I saw on the tour that I did, as I said, with Food Tours in Miami, is the Lincoln Theater. And so this is right on Lincoln. I keep saying Lincoln Avenue or Lincoln Street, and I think I'm getting it backwards. Lincoln Road, right on the Lincoln Road Mall. If you look at a lot of the buildings, they have been repurposed, though. It's right across from the building that used to be the Cadillac and is now a guest store, and the Lincoln Theater is no longer a theater. It's an H&S. But if you go inside, it still actually has the proscenium and where the screen was, and it still has the balconies. Beautiful building with this chrome on the outside. Very, very Art Deco.
Its facade is really classic Art Deco. It really is, even though it's got the H&M sign on it now. You're like, still, it's what you're looking for when you... To me, it's that style just says tropical feel.
Well, yeah, especially the Miami version, which uses a lot of pastels and things like that. Some of the buildings that have the most interesting Art Deco facades, there's a series of small boutique hotels now that are reopening in some of these buildings over by the beach. Even places like Señor Frog's, which isn't necessarily the high-class building. It's a beautiful Art Deco building, and if you stand on that corner, you see a number of different beautiful Art Deco buildings today. I have a blog post that I'll send you to with some of the photos that I have from the Art Deco tour we did and some of the things that I saw that were my favorites on that.
Yeah, it's one of those styles that's it's a very modern style. So a lot of that's still very well preserved, even though the buildings aren't. A lot of them have been reapportioned for other uses other than what they originally were. But it is certainly a style that is certainly unique to a certain few areas. You're not going to find a lot of Art Deco in a lot of different places, but the places you do find it's certainly a lot of it around. I mean, that all of Miami Beach, that central Lincoln Road
Yeah.
Mall area, has got
It's
a bunch
a
of it.
historic area where you have to preserve these buildings. Well, I think the one thing that's real different too about Miami is a lot of these are small buildings. That's why I say they've been turned into maybe a boutique hotel or a dentist office
Sure.
or something like that. Not like, say, the Chrysler building in New York City, which is big and impressive. These are more modest from that point of view. And then again,
Yeah.
a lot of pastels and soft beach colors and things like that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Other things we want to talk about in Miami?
An area I was charmed by on my last visit back in 2016 is an area called Wynwood.
Okay.
That's Wynwood. This is an area of Miami that was, for a lot of years, took a beating. It had a higher crime rate, and Miami's got a couple areas that are now starting to gentrify really well, and this is a classic example of it. And the biggest highlight of Wynwood is the Wynwood Walls. We talked about street art earlier when we talked about Little Havana. And this area it's an old cola plant. So
okay,
it was one of the buildings that was left and just kind of crumbled, and some street artists got in there and started doing all of these absolutely fabulous murals. And over the course of time, it has become a major tourist attraction. It's also led to the area becoming kind of a chic area. It's got a lot of shops and cool restaurants. The area has a number of microbreweries that are right within walking distance of just about everything. It is a small area. And when I went there to visit, I was told this is the area to stay in Wynwood. Don't wander outside of it because the areas around are still in transition. But the small core of Wynwood was fascinating. And there's just so much street art. The Wynwood Walls is actually a more touristy part of it. The cola plant I mentioned isn't part of the actual Wynwood Walls, but it's still street art. There's a couple different places to go there where they have this fantastic street art, and it's just such great food and beautiful at night. Funny thing is, I was there on a January evening, and temperatures got into the upper 50s. And being from Michigan, I was walking around shorts and a t-shirt. I had no issue whatsoever. I screamed tourist, but everybody else there was in snowmobile suits and thinking they were going to die from the 50-degree temperatures. But it was a beautiful, gorgeous evening as far as I was concerned. And if you get one of those in South Florida, that's great. And it was just perfect for walking. I walked around all night and just could not believe the artwork. And artwork on the side of buildings, just one of the microbreweries I went to had a beautiful mural painted on the side of it. So, I mean, there's just so much good street art down there. And like I say, chic little shops and good street food and also some very good restaurants. So I'd highly recommend the Wynwood area.
Okay. Also, when we talk about South Beach, there's great big long white sand beach there. Wide, beautiful, beautiful people there. You mentioned going in the winter. If you can't go in the winter, I was there in May and the weather was lovely. It was not quite as warm and uncomfortable as it will get in the summertime. If you're there in August, and the last time I had been there was in August, where it was one of those things where you really wanted to shower a couple times a day because it was just very, very muggy. So it was 96, and that was just the humidity. So
you hope for the best with places like this as far as weather goes. You're going to pay for the crowds. The good weather of the winter time, you're going to pay with the crowds that all flock to South Florida for the exact same reason that you're there, is because where you're from in the north or the Midwest or somewhere, it is nice and snowbound. When you get to Miami and you're wearing shorts in January, it's a beautiful thing. You're talking about water and beaches and stuff. One of the things that I personally have not done, but I know a lot of people who have, is taking advantage of the water activities that you could do in that area, like Biscayne Bay.
Sure, yeah.
The Biscayne Harbor. We talked about South Beach and Miami Beach, and that's on a barrier island. The area in between is Biscayne, and there are so many places where you can rent kayaks, these stand-up paddle boards. You can do windsurfing, you can do canoeing, and once you get away from the city part, especially south, heading towards the Keys area, there's the gigantic expanse of Biscayne National Park that's down there, and it's a very unique national park in that most of it is water. So you can go to the visitor center, you can walk a couple boardwalks out there, but you're really not, this is not your classic national park. But you can rent stand-up paddle boards, and you can explore the ecosystems, which are Biscayne National Park. And that goes for the whole area. Once you're away from the city, the wildlife is more abundant, and especially the ocean-going life that you can see there. But there's a lot of reasons to get out in the water. And not just the adventure sports type, the kayaking and paddleboarding and stuff. You can do all kinds of cruises. I mean, there's just it would be impossible now to list all of the options you have for getting out in the water as
Right.
far as paid
Yep.
tours and cruises, which would be tours of the port of Miami, which I did and was fascinated by the amount of shipping that they do in and out of that port, and harbor cruises where they take you up into Miami Beach and off of South Beach, and they show you this celebrity's gigantic mansion in the distance, and homes that sell in for a couple $1 million and stuff, and that's great. And then they do sunset, they do dinner cruises, they do dolphin watching cruises. Again, it's an exhaustive list, so find what appeals to you and
Right.
do your research, and I'm sure there's an option that water-wise in Miami that fits you.
Okay. Well, and you mentioned Biscayne National Park. That also anchors the eastern edge of the Keys, which I think we will do a little later. But you mentioned wildlife. So let's go to where you're going to find the wildlife.
Yeah, that's the Everglades. No doubt about it. The Everglades is remarkable. I'd say it's actually 9 different separate ecosystems that are listed by the National Park Service when talking about the park. And in fact, the beautiful color map that comes on the brochure for the park will highlight all those ecosystems for you. It's also available at nps.gov. It's worth taking a look at, because it's hard, because you think of national parks and you think if you go to Yosemite, you're gonna look out over the Glacier Point into the Yosemite Valley. If you go to Yellowstone, you're gonna see Old Faithful. The Everglades, it's an ecosystem that on its face you're looking at a swamp.
Right.
And that's hard to appreciate how unique this area is. And the Everglades are a third of the size that they were before Miami started growing, and still the growth of Miami is still beginning to encroach on them in a way that is not healthy for them. This is an ecosystem that is severely threatened by water demands down there, and also the encroachment from. There's a lot going on there, and we had mentioned off the air before we came on that Hurricane Irma has affected large parts of the southern parts of this park, which wiped out a lot of their tourist services, storm surge, and everything. And that's tough, because if you're going to get to the Everglades, and as gorgeous and as absolutely unbelievable as it is, it's still only a third of what it used to be. So it's worth getting in there, and it's just so diverse.
It's a fairly big park, too, when you consider how close it is to Miami, how close it is to a large urban area. Where would you recommend, if we had like a day or two to focus on the Everglades, what would you do with that time?
I'm going to give you a little trivia first here, Chris, and see if you can get this. You mentioned the size of the park. It is a very large park. It is actually the 3rd largest national park. You want to guess the other 2?
I'm going to say Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska.
Oh, I'm sorry, lower 48.
Oh, lower 48. Sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
One's in your state, and one is very famous.
In my state, I want to say Death Valley is the largest.
There you go. That's the one.
Ones in California. Okay. And the other one is very famous. I would say, am I in North Carolina?
Nope.
Then I've got the wrong one. No, what's the Yellowstone.
There you go.
Sorry.
That's the Everglades, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. But
oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
That seems really late for how unique this was. As far as where to start with the Everglades, everybody has a different travel need.
Yep.
And the coolest stuff in the Everglades is obviously on the water. So if you're really adventurous, you can rent a canoe and go on a 10-day camping tour down the eastern side of the park through the 10,000 lakes and all these inland trails, they call them, but they're all water, and you can stop at all these little campgrounds which have no land access whatsoever. You're going to just be able to stop and camp in these absolutely dumbfoundingly beautiful and unique places where your night sky is going to be outstanding, because you're hundreds of miles away from a city, and it's just you out camping on this small little tuft of land that is actually elevated enough to put a tent on.
Well, you can't ever get hundreds of miles away from Miami and be in the Everglades.
That's true. Well, you're going to be at least 100 miles away, or close to.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to be in the wilderness part of this park. Yeah, and the ambient light, from what I understand, the people said that just the canopy of stars is just outstanding.
Okay.
So it's not a dark sky park like Grand Canyon or Yellowstone, but it is one of those places where wildlife comes out at night. I have friends who did this. I'm not as adventurous as that I've done this yet. I would love to, but I had friends who said the biggest thing they had trouble adjusting to was the hearing of all the movement of the animals and the reptiles and the birds and stuff at night in the swamp areas around you. When you're camping out in these middle, you're like, oh, is that a crocodile sliding up on my little hammock of trees here? And a lot of that starts in the eastern portion of the park. This is more accessible from the Gulf side, which is Marco Island, Naples, Fort Myers Beach area.
Okay.
But that's out of the Gulf Coast Visitor Center area on that east side. And that's where a lot of the canoe trails start from. The other two parts, the Tamanami Trail runs from the Gulf side all the way into Miami, and that crosses the northern half of the park. It also crosses Big Cypress National Preserve, which isn't part of the Everglades necessarily, but is very similar to the Everglades in that it's protecting a large portion of mostly swampland. So the big drive into the park takes place just south of Miami, right near, the junction is right near Homestead or Florida City, which is outside of Miami and is a good place to find inexpensive lodging if you're not into camping in the park and you don't want to do that. Homestead and Florida City would have your lodging options. It's a fairly long road that runs out into the heart of the park, and you can see a lot of the different ecosystems. You'll see the pinelands, which is not something you expect to find in a park like the Everglades where it's mostly swamp. This is not pine forest like you would see in the American Midwest or the Rocky Mountain area, but it's still, there are pine trees there, and when you've seen so much grassland, seeing a old hardwood pine forest, the remnants of an old hardwood pine forest in this type of ecosystem is absolutely fascinating, and it feels different from the park. You can tell that the temperatures are a little cooler and everything else. And that's the Pinelands area of the park is right as you enter this road that runs out to the Flamingo area of the park. There's a really interesting side trip off of there, and this is where the history of the Everglades meets modern history. There is a Nike Hercules missile site that has been preserved by the National Park Service that is on a side road that breaks off near the Pinelands area and gives you sort of a glimpse into Cold War era history when you're looking at this ancient national park, which the Everglades is. So something very interesting to do. And they have people who had served at the base serving as guides, and they're there to answer questions and stuff. So it's a unique little side excursion off of that for sure.
Okay. Nike missiles are anti-aircraft missiles, so that would have been protecting Florida from things like, we say missiles in Cuba. Anyone ever want to do that? So, yeah, okay.
I had been to the Everglades a few other times, and I had not. This is a fairly recent thing that they have preserved this, but it's still a fascinating thing to see. And I sort of just stumbled on it, and they don't throw a lot of literature out there about it. And I just saw a missile site, and I was like, okay, if this is open, I'm going to go check it out. So I drove the long way down this little road and was surprised to see something of that type. When you're there for wildlife and for hiking on the boardwalks and stuff like that, and to get a little bit of history in there is always a good thing. Again, the road dips down and heads into the Flamingo is at the very southern tip, and that's the area we mentioned that was affected very much by Irma. So there are currently no boat tours out of that area. A lot of times you can get out into Florida Bay, which is where the freshwater of the inland part of the Everglades, the freshwater prairies, and the coastal marshes, that's where it meets Florida Bay, which is the saltwater portion of the park. So again, before you would head down there, you'd want to check and make sure that they've managed to reopen a lot of that as well.
Okay. And we're recording this in 2018, so probably 2019, most of that will be reopened by then, I would guess.
That's the goal, my guess would be for tourism season in the fall and winter months, would be my guess is when they would be going for that. So.
Well, and I know when I was down in the Keys, and again, we'll get to that in a little bit here, a lot of the state parks were back in operation just this summer. So it took 3/4 of a year, basically, to get a lot of the cleanup done there.
Yeah. So we mentioned it's a real ecological and wildlife preserve. There's endangered species galore. I don't have an exact number. I think 300 between all the birds and animals sticks in my head, but that could be a little bit off. But the most famous one is the Florida panther, which if you see one, good on you. I've been 5 times to the Everglades, and I can't ever recall being ever close to even seeing one. Or, from what I understand, there's only 160 left in the wild, which is a shame. But if you see one, they're very furtive. You'll see the signs all over the park where slow down. The last thing you want to do is be responsible for an accident with one of these 160 left in the wild.
That would be bad, yeah.
Yes, not good. The West Indian manatee, which is a species of manatee, is also in the park, but also very furtive and something you might not see a lot, but it's another one of these endangered species. And the
Well, my understanding is that the manatees in general in Florida have actually just been upgraded from endangered to threatened. That they're
I'm pretty
actually
sure the West Indian though is one of
that
the
one. That was
subspecies
going
that's
to ask.
still,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, yeah. This is the rare one that lives in the really warmer waters,
Okay.
and
Got it.
yeah, because I mean, you see a lot of manatees. I was shocked when I was a kid. We never going down to Florida. We never saw manatees, and I just did an experience back in '16 on the same trip where I was actually able to get in the water and swim outside of a couple hours outside of Tampa, where they put you in the water and the manatees just swim around you. That was a unique experience for sure.
Well, and it's not difficult to figure out why manatees have been either threatened or endangered because they basically identify manatees these days by the scars on their back from boat propellers. So, it's pretty obvious that manatees and powerboats are not a good combination.
Nope. And being a 1,500-pound mammal,
Yep.
they are not aggressive in any way, shape, or form. I had trouble getting my mask sealed on this excursion. I was in the water, and I had my GoPro on me, and I ducked back down under the water after I think I'd finally gotten it sealed, and I had two swimming straight at me, and I know they're not going to hurt me, and I still froze, and I held onto the GoPro and hope I got a footage, but they just sort of squeezed me as they went by. Just completely harmless. So they're not so non-aggressive that their ability to defend themselves, even in cases of natural predators, is even tough too. So I'm going to run through a list of the Everglades stuff that you can do there, and this is not by far not a comprehensive list. The park, again, is so huge and so diverse that you could do a million different things, but they have some biking options. In the Pinelands area, which I mentioned, there are 43 miles of improved and unimproved trails. Shark Valley, which is off the Tamanami Trail, which again runs from the Gulf side to the Miami area, that has a 15-mile paved trail, and that's wonderful for families. That is, if you're taking your family, that's one to definitely look into. At the base of the Shark Valley Trail, there is a observation tower, which when you climb out, you can look all over this sea of grass, which is what the Everglades essentially means. Boating options, tours they start from Miami. The famous ones are the airboats, which I personally think are obnoxious. They're just too loud, and I'm not a
They're
fan.
very loud, yeah.
When I was a kid, I was like, oh yeah, this is cool, but now I don't think I'd want to venture out to that option. But again, that's for everybody else to decide. And I know people go on them and say that's, and you can do those both from the Miami side and also from the Gulf side over on that side too. Canoeing and kayaking are the way to really get out. If you're into an adventurous side at all, this is one way to get really close to the wildlife and see a lot of the areas of the park that you're not going to see on the bigger boat tours. They have regular boat tours. The last time I was there, I did one out of Flamingo where we did some of these small inland lakes where you'll see mostly birds, but you'll also see some alligators and stuff. It was a real eco tour, but you can find boat tours of any speed, any type of you're looking for, whatever fits your travel style. You can definitely find them out of all three areas to start in the park.
And I just wanted to clarify, too, when you've been saying Flamingo, that's the Flamingo Visitor Center, which is the end of the road that goes from Miami Homestead and then down into the southern tip of the Everglades.
Yep, that is true.
Yep.
And that's the area, again, that's been really affected by Irma. That's the area I visited in 2016 before Irma, and it's one of those places. That's one of the two campgrounds in the park. The other one is at the Lone Pine Key area, which is up in the Pinelands area right as you enter the park. Those are the two major campgrounds in the area. But the backcountry, and that's one of the activities I was going to mention, the backcountry is full of these campgrounds that you can only get to by canoe or kayak or on the water of some sort. So the two main ones are the Flamingo campground and the Long Pine Key campground. So, and camping's cool there. It's is one of the experiences you would call it a uniquely Everglades experience. There's lots of hiking available there. There's a lot of boardwalks where you can do the simple things, and they walk you out into the boardwalks are built on these and through the swamp areas of the sloughs. But you could also do some of your own off-trail hiking, whether it be guided or not guiding, and they call it slogging, which is one of the...
And you're saying slough, that's what I would say slough? S-L-O-U-G-H?
Yeah, slough. So they,
okay.
Slough. But this is slogging through sometimes knee, sometimes hip deep water.
Okay.
So you can do the slough, or I'm pronouncing wrong, slogging, but that's something I haven't done there, and I don't know, the idea of being wet that long doesn't really appeal to me. But people who have done it, the reviews online and everything are just outstanding as far as they get you into some areas of the park that even you can't get to by boat. So you're walking through these saltwater marshes in a lot of cases, and the nature, the wildlife is incredible. I think I've covered most of what the Everglades has to offer. The 10,000 Islands area is the western side, the Gulf side of the park, and the Long Pine Key is the eastern side, and Flamingo is the southern side. So there's only a limited amount of road access to a lot of these places.
Okay. Well, and I do want to get to our third destination, which is just south of there. The Florida Keys include the southernmost portion of the continental U.S. here.
Yeah, the Keys are essentially, there's just one road in and out. It's US 1, famous Highway US 1, which enters the Keys on Key Largo, which is the northernmost of the Keys, and then runs all the way down to Key West in the very south and western portion of the Florida Keys. And the Keys are, on the right weather day, it's hard to imagine a more ideally tropical setting in the United States than the Florida Keys. When the sun's out and the water is that just crystalline blue, it's the drive on US 1, especially once you get past Marathon. There's two keys past Key Largo that are also more touristy and also more affordable as far as the Keys go. And using affordable and referring to the Keys is tough. But Key Largo, the rule of the Keys is the closer you get to Key West, the more expensive the lodging is going to be. So keep that in mind. And if you're staying in Key Largo and you expect to drive all the way down to Key West every day, that's not also going to happen. This is, I think, 90 or so miles, but being the only road there, US 1 can be a very slow slog.
Well, and as you get closer to Key West, I think as I recall, the speed limit dropped to, I want to say 35 at some point. So I drove from Key Largo to Key West in one day, and that's certainly easy to do. But with stops along the way, which I certainly recommend stopping along the way, it took most of the day. It was a good long day.
Yeah, but also a beautiful drive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, also a beautiful drive. And especially on the two keys I just mentioned, on Marathon and Isla Mirada, and also Key Largo as well, the traffic is really heavy. So a lot of times, especially if you're in the prime tourist season. So even if you get some 45-mile-an-hour speed limits, don't expect to be at that most of the time. But just enjoy your surroundings and go down. And there are places to stop and enjoy along the way. And I'll talk about the Upper Keys real quick first, which is Key Largo. There's the one place that I went to that I thought was absolutely fascinating was the Florida Keys Wild Bird Sanctuary and Rehabilitation Center.
Oh, good, because I did not get to that. It was pouring rain when I got there. Okay.
Great place. And you have the opportunity to adopt a bird to sponsor their rehabilitation, and anything from the smallest little birds to the larger ibis and flamingo style, everything's there. And you see them up close, and these are great people. And I was just blown away there. And you get to can photograph the birds up close, and you can't help but go in there and have your heartstrings tugged on, and you're going to want to donate. Your admissions fees go towards the rehabilitation. They were doing great work there. The more famous site on Key Largo is John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park. And this is a very diverse park. It's right after US 1 turns onto the Keys. So it's a very thick with tourism area. But if you don't get a chance to drive all the way up to Key West, this is a great place to go because you can do some diving on the coral reef. They have every different kind of, again, we talked about the abundance of boat tours and water things you do. You can canoe, kayak, you can get in the water and scuba. There are glass bottom boat tours of this area, and every type of visitor amenity you can even imagine in John Pennekamp. Great place.
Well, and you mentioned getting on the water. One of the, I would say, unusual in the sense that you can only do it in Key Largo that I did when I was there. Very touristy, but fun, is I went out on the African Queen.
Wow.
So the boat that was used in the movie African Queen was a real boat that was basically at use in Africa for, I think, 40 years before they made the film. And it has been restored in a lot of ways, but it's still this steam-powered boat that chugs its way along in the inner harbors there in Key Largo that you can take a little tour on. I mean, it doesn't go that far. For somebody who's a nerd, seeing this this steam-powered boat is kind of fun to see how these things were built at the time.
That's fascinating. That's in Key Largo,
That's in Key Largo, because both Key Largo and The African Queen, of course, being big Humphrey Bogart movies, and they still do a big Humphrey Bogart film festival in Key Largo every year.
That's amazing. That would be a really cool experience. That's cool. And Key Largo we mentioned Key Largo is a great place as far as if you're going to look for in a touristy area, that's as good a place as any. Key Largo is kind of great because it allows you access. If you're going to stay a week and you don't want to move hotels, Key Largo is as good a place as any because you can take the drive down the Keys, and you can also have access to the Everglades and to Miami as well.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So good place to be. And I would imagine you'd find more cheap lodging deals in Key Largo than anywhere else. I know that as a fact. Like I said, it's closer you get to Key West, you're going to be paying a lot more.
I didn't find any when I was there in May, but yeah, okay.
I mentioned Isla Morada and Marathon Keys. Those are two that are sort of towards the Miami area in that they are touristy and there are a lot of cheap lodging options, but also a lot of places, a lot of kitschy tourist stuff there. And it's just one of those things where you're really there for beachcombing, the water sports I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Specific sites on those are still harder to find. I was looking up because I have not stayed overnight on either of them. I always tend to go down and just pay the money to stay in Key West, but you'll see a lot of touristy type experiences. First of all, there are places that are going to give you every type of seafood you could ever imagine.
Sure, yeah.
So if you're going to want to get into that type of cuisine, these are great places to try them. And typical Keys type flair in these restaurants. There's a romantic notion of the Keys, and these restaurants tend to really play that up. And like you said, it's a more family-friendly environment. I wouldn't refer to Key West as family-friendly necessarily.
Key West is a different place, and we'll save that for a little bit. There's a couple places that I stopped at that I really appreciated before we get to Key West. One was a state park on the way down there. Great place for a little, I want to say hike, but really more like walks, because the other thing, too, is Florida is flat.
Yes, a little bit.
Tallest mountain in Florida is Space Mountain. So, I mean, you're never really hiking. You're walking if you're out in the woods. But the Windley Key State Fossil Reef State Park is very, very cool. One is there's nature hikes that go through. As you're driving down the Keys, you're not seeing a lot of palm trees. You're seeing a lot of scrub forests, most of it kept by the hurricanes and things like that so that it doesn't get as tall as the power lines.
You get a lot of mangroves.
Yeah. Well, but as you get inside of some of this, some of it is hardwood forest, ironwoods and other things along that. As you're doing the nature hike, and they give you a guide to recognize what you're seeing, that you can get out there into some of the woods just right off the highway. I mean, the Keys are really, really narrow. At time, you can see the water on both sides, even if you're not on a bridge. I mean, it's very, very narrow until you get down to Key West, where it gets a little wider, and a couple places along the way. But the other thing that's really cool about this particular park is that they use this as a quarry to quarry fossilized coral. And so you can see just walls where you can walk up to them and identify the different types of coral that are fossilized in this wall. Very cool. It was very cheap in terms of entrance fee. It wouldn't take you that long to go and see it, but someplace I would recommend stopping. And then the other one that it was not on my itinerary. I went down there with the tourism board there, and they did not put the History of Diving Museum on my itinerary. And I had read about it, and I thought, well, this seems like it's just going to be a little dinky museum. So I almost didn't stop. I think I actually backed up and went back to it because it was a little bigger than I thought. And so I went in and I asked some questions, and it actually has if you're into deep water diving, and I don't mean necessarily just scuba, but think about the people in the old diving suits. They have an amazing collection, for instance, of both historic and modern and international diving equipment. And even as a non-diver, I thought it was fascinating to see both the replica of the diving suit that was invented by Edmund Halley, who discovered Halley's Comet, as well as modern deep diving equipment, as well as, I don't remember how many different diving helmets from different regions, somewhere like 3 dozen or something like that. So it was a fascinating little museum. Especially if you're into diving, I would recommend that as a place to stop.
And this is on Isla Morada, one of the ones I just mentioned.
Yeah,
I just looked it up.
exactly.
I've driven by it a number of times now that you mention it the next time I get out there. And I do owe the Keys a trip, and I will explain that when we get to a certain national park that you and I both adore. At the end of the trip, I need to get back out there because I owe that park another visit. But this is on the museum you just mentioned is on Isla Morada, which again is one of those. I'd say that's where family-friendly Keys sort of stops at Isla Morada, because just beyond Isla Morada is the famous 7 Mile Bridge, which you've seen from the movie True Lies, but it's also one of those where I've had, unfortunately, not the greatest weather. But all the travels I've done, I've been blessed in the weather I've got. But the Keys, I've had some dicey weather. The last time my dad and I were out there in 2016, we went over in the ocean, over the 7 Mile Bridge, and the ocean was just slate gray. But if you get the 7 Mile Bridge on a gorgeous sunny day, you are in tropical paradise. You just look around and think, oh my goodness, this is absolutely gorgeous. Just beyond that area, you heading towards Key West, you get to Bahia Key, which is the Bahia Honda State Park, is one of the largest state parks down there, and it has what you and I refer to as hiking in the Keys, which is just walking on flat ground and seeing the ecosystem. But it's a very large state park. It's got a bunch of good beaches. It has a little bit of camping that you can do there. Also on Big Pine Key, in the Big Pine Key area, is the Key Deer Wildlife Refuge. Key deer are small, just small deer. Did you see any key deer when you were down there?
I did not.
I've never seen them in the wild.
Yeah, I did go up into a little bit into that park, but I did not see any key deer.
They're very small.
Yeah, they remind me of dik from Africa. You can tell they're in the deer family, but they're half the size. Well, or a third the size even.
Like size of a large dog in most cases. And especially when you get into this area, the signs throughout on US 1 emphasize very carefully to slow down for the sake of the key deer, because this is another species that has not benefited in any way from the populating of the Keys. And they're so small, and you see them a lot at night. Again, I've never seen them in the wild. I've seen them in the refuge where they have rehabilitating ones. But it's one of those things where you don't want to be involved in that kind of thing. So slow down and take it easy on the key deer. And they do have the Key Deer Refuge is one of those places where my wildlife friends have referred to it. One of them told me when I was asking her about this area before the podcast, she referred to it as magical. So she just thought that the Key Deer Refuge was just a wonderful place. And that sort of leads you into Key West. And then you're at the end of the road.
And you said Key West a little less family friendly.
A little bit.
It doesn't mean it can't be family friendly in Key West.
Sure.
It's just that it's one of the only places I've seen where right downtown there was a clothing optional bar.
Yeah.
I didn't go in the clothing optional bar. That's not something anybody wants to see. Well, I mean, not the bar. I'm thinking me, clothing optional.
Yeah, me neither.
It is a party town. I liked Key West.
Yeah.
Let me say that first of all. Great food, some interesting history there, like the Truman Western White House there, the tour I did, fascinating. The conch tour, which looks like an incredibly, we recommended it the last time we did a show in Key West, of riding this conch train, which to me, just these tourist trains look so touristy, but the guides were so knowledgeable of the different history of the little towns, and also got you out into the pretty small cottages and houses in Key West that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. But it also feels like it's a crazy party place.
Yeah, I'm with you. I see something touristy and I'm like, oh goodness, I'm going to run the other way from that.
Right.
But in some cases, some of that is very interesting. And when you look for a place that's as quirky, oh no, I gave up one of my 3 words at the end. All right, anyway, but you get one of the places that's quirky like Key West. That's part of what it is. So you want to see those places, and you want to know about them. And the Conch Republic part is part of what they identify with down there. And
well, you say the Conch Republic. So Key West has declared its independence at one point because they were so frustrated with the national government.
Yeah.
And declared themselves the Conch Republic.
Yeah.
It's that kind of place.
It's soft beat. It's expat mostly. I don't think I ever, in all my times in there, have met anybody who was born and raised in Key West, for goodness sake. So it's one of those places where people who want tropical and want kind of offbeat, and people, especially people in the service industry who can get down there, they can certainly do well. I don't know how they afford to live down there, but yet they can still do very well down there. So
Well, and now you are seeing palm trees, and now it really does look much more beach town, much more tropical, much more party town. Lots of nightlife, great food scene. Terrific restaurants and things down there.
Again, I don't want to discourage families from going, because there are some. Let me just cover that so that the family friendly part is, we can dispel that a little bit, because there is. I wouldn't walk Duval Street. The T-shirts alone on Duval Street are enough to make even somebody as liberal as I am blush.
Oh gosh, I don't remember that. Okay.
Oh goodness gracious! Yeah, there's some. I don't want to go into it because I don't want to lose your clean rating on this. But there are some really sort of outlandish T-shirt shops, and
Yeah.
a lot of the tourism feeds into that party aspect. And I wouldn't refer to it as family friendly, but there are options down there for families. Certainly, I mean, you mentioned the Truman Little White House, a lot of history there.
Yep.
Hemingway had a home down there, and they've turned it into a wonderful museum and tried to recreate what it would have been like when Hemingway lived down there. Fort Zachary Taylor is a fort from 1848 that is just on the outside of the downtown area. They do tours every day at 11 a.m.
And I didn't get there, but it's also recommended as the best swimming beach in Key West.
Yeah, Key West is short on swimming beaches. Smathers Beach to the south is not what I would refer to as a great swimming beach. It's a great beach to bike along because they got a real wonderful bike path down there, but I wouldn't refer to it as a swimming beach. So I did swim there, but that's a good point on Zachary Taylor. But there's a butterfly and nature conservatory down there, which was also wonderful, where they do a lot of rehabilitation on rare species of butterflies and stuff like that. As with everything in Key West, it's really expensive to do, but it's one of those things I'd refer to as family friendly. And then they have 1,000 southernmost blank in the U.S. things. And the two most famous, I think, are probably the southernmost point of U.S. 1, where there's a sign there where you're walking to get your picture taken under it says U.S. 1 end. Okay, so this road that runs from Maine all the way to the Keys ends here. Very good. And then also the large conical statue type thing that has the southernmost point in the U.S. where pretty much everybody's got a picture taken there. I would assume you have your picture there.
I don't have my picture because I just saw it from the conch train and didn't go back again, and I didn't feel the need to have. I am not someone who needs to have my picture in front of that spot. I need to have a picture of the sign or of the marker. I know what I look like.
I probably didn't need it either because I have 4 different ones. I have one from my first visit in 2002 and then one from 2016. And every one I say, boy, that is not the same person that was there in 2002. But anyway, I've got 4 different pictures in front of this southernmost point.
A lot of people do get to. We actually have an article on Amateur Traveler written by Erik about the northernmost point in the continental U.S. that very few people get to. That I think is a little more interesting if you're interested in geography. This one is more common. I mean, a lot of people get to Key West, and I recommend getting into Key West. Key West is fun.
Wait in line for this one.
Yes.
You generally, if you want your picture there, you're going to wait in a 10, 15. I must have waited close to half an hour last time I was there in January, my dad and I, to get that picture. So yeah, it's touristy. Boy, is it touristy, but it's still cool. And if you want that, I mean, it's as iconic as Key West gets. So go get your picture taken there and good enough.
We have at least one more spot, which we both want to talk about, but you want to talk about some other non-family friendly things in Key West first.
Not in particular. Just the Duval Street area is the main drag. It runs down to Mallory Square, which is the main square. During the day, I suppose it's marginally tame. At night, I wouldn't refer to tame as tame at all. It's a great place, and the times I've gone in with a group of friends, those stories aren't suitable for most years. But I mean, it's one of those places where you can have a good time with people, and the weather's so conducive to being able to drink outdoors. And you mentioned the food. It's crazy because it's every type of food that you would want is represented in Key West. And it's not just the stuff you'd expect to find in Florida, which is the heavily Hispanic influence or the Cuban. And there is everything. There's a great, and I don't know if it's still in business because I couldn't remember the name of it, but there was a restaurant in Key West that focused on African cuisine, which was fascinating that we did one night. But there was everything down there. There's steakhouses and just everything you can want. And that also goes for the abundance of things you can drink down there. There's tropical fruity drinks. They do just everything. Jimmy Buffett's famous restaurants down there. So anyway, that's all there if you want that. And Key West parties until the morning. So.
And the one party that everybody's invited to that I would say is family friendly is the sunset. Yeah. Going out to the plaza and watching the sunset.
Gallery Square. Yep.
Gallery Square. Although they built a artificial island kind of right in between you and the sunsets, which I
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
thought was unfortunate. But there's street performers there and other things going on, so a lot of people will come down to there for sunset before going off to dinner.
Sunsets in tropical regions tend to go pretty well. You get a higher percentage of them because a lot of places you're looking for sunsets don't have the weather that they do down in Key West. So
Right. I actually saw a better sunset on a restaurant deck in Key Largo than I did from Key West, just because I was down in the square for
sure.
the sunset, and it really was setting over an island.
Yeah.
But it's a scene. I mean, it's a fascinating party.
And the people watching down in Mallory Square is also fascinating. And also, it's one of those places that's so internationally known.
Oh, yeah. The number of languages that I heard being spoken there was notable.
And the cruise ships all dock very near there. So a lot of these people are finishing their day of wandering around all the Key West sites, and they're going to hop back on their cruise ship at night and find their way to whatever the next destination on that cruise itinerary is. So, yeah, it is a very international scene down there.
Now, we have come to the end of the road, but I know you and I have one more destination we want to cover past the end of the road.
Save the best for last.
Okay.
Yep. And it is Dry Tortugas National Park, which is a Civil War era fort that was built on a key out in the 70 miles from Key West.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this in my original podcast, the National Parks one, and I was so happy to see you finally got a chance to get out there. It was originally discovered by Ponce de Leon back in the 1500s, 1513 to be exact, and they built the Civil War era fort out there, and it is one of the just so singular experiences I've done in all the national parks I've visited. It is such a singular experience.
You can take the ferry out there. It's a couple-hour ferry ride to go out there. I mean, you're out there past the end of the road, as we said, or you can take a seaplane out there, which would be a lot of fun. It's a little more expensive. Well, it's a lot more expensive than taking the ferry out, but get you there and much quicker with obviously a view as well. So some people were definitely going out for seeing the fort, like I was. Huge brick built before the Civil War, but I think the height of its use was the Civil War.
It started in 1846, it was essentially it's most of its use came around the Civil War era.
Exactly, to help enforce the embargo of ships coming out of the south by the north. I would say another third of people came just for the ride and for snorkeling, although the day I was there, the snorkeling it was less than it usually is, according to locals, because the storm had been through and had just ruined the visibility. It had churned everything up, but you'll have this. Sometimes that happens. And then I'd say the other third of people came out as birders. Huge contingent of birders on our boat who were there for the large and varied flocks of birds that were out there.
It's migratory bird stop along so many that migrate from the North American continent to the South American continent stop there in the Dry Tortugas. You got lucky because this is where I mentioned I owe this another visit. My dad and I had reserved the ferry out to actually camp, which you can do out there overnight, which my one other visit in I did not do, but I'm dying to go out there and camp. You pop a tent and camp on the beach overnight thing. And our tour was canceled due to inclement weather. There were large crests, and they were not going to run the ferry that day or any of the 3 days around the day we were in Key West. So we drove all the way out to Key West, and we had it canceled. So someday I will get out there and camp overnight because, as we talked about, night sky.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be a pretty remarkable thing out there, and it is a dark sky park as well. So I did price these out just to give a 2018 idea for people listening. The ferries, for the day ferry, it's $180, and the camping excursion's about $200. So it's not a cheap excursion, but nothing in the Keys is. The seaplane goes up considerably, and the half-day excursion's $350, and the full day is $600. Looking at the views I've seen from some of these videos that I've looked at, flying in, it might be worth every penny of that to get the experience of flying in over the fort. So that's something someday I would love to have the opportunity to do. But it's fascinating. For being in the middle of nowhere, it's got a history. One of the conspirators in the Abraham Lincoln shooting, in the assassination, Dr. Samuel Mudd, who really his only involvement was repairing the leg of John Wilkes Booth. He's the most famous person who was ever kept there as sort of a prisoner. He was sent there in 1865 after his trial. And after aiding a yellow fever epidemic that took the fort in 1867, he was finally pardoned in 1869 and released. But that is a very interesting portion of and probably the most famous name and most interesting portion of the fort's history. Military-wise, it never really saw any action.
There was a race at the beginning of the Civil War. The Northerners got there quicker the Southerners showed up with a warship, and the Northerners said, "You have to leave, or we're going to blow you out of the water." And so they left, not knowing the Northerners had gotten there before their cannon.
Had no guns. Had no guns.
No
Fascinating
guns at all.
piece of history. Yeah, fascinating piece of history. Yeah, it's such a unique place, and you get the tour, and then you wander around, and just it's one of these places you can't believe you're actually at. It's otherworldly, and I think you and I both were smitten by this experience. Just something that if you're into unique travel experiences, this is one of those that's worth every penny you're going to pay.
Well, and it is expensive, as you said. It does include the rental of the snorkel gear, though, too. So it isn't like you have to decide, do you want to pay that additionally? So I would recommend, there's time after you do the tour to still get in the water too, and I would recommend doing that. Excellent. We are going to need to wrap this up because this is going into our longest episode territory.
We talk all the time, Chris. We go and go. Okay, let's finish up with your questions.
Let's do some of our wrap-up questions here. You're standing in the prettiest spot in southern Florida. Where are you standing, and what are you looking at?
I think you would find a spot in Key West for those, or on the Keys for a sunset. That's probably as good. And honestly, or in Miami for sunrise. I'm a sucker for these. So if you listen to my other podcasts, I'm always going to add these in. I'm always going to add these in as sunrise and sunset. Sunrise in the Miami area, if you can get out on one of the beach areas and do that sunrise, or in the Keys somewhere where one of these artificial islands isn't blocking your view. Just the Caribbean sunsets and sunrises are amazing.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in southern Florida.
Mention the T-shirts in Key West. I mean, it's singular. I mean, there's a lot of party places, I suppose, in the U.S., but in all my travels, I would associate that with Key West. So I would say that counterculture part of Key West is very, very funny and very fun.
Again, I loved Key West, but I did have the sense that, there was some sense of, hey, the crazies went to the end of the road and ran out of a highway and stopped here.
That's probably a good description. Yep.
Oh, well, and I say that the crazies, a lot of artistic people have ended up here, a lot of novelists and such. We mentioned Hemingway, but a number of other artists and musicians have ended up in Key West. So there's something about that end of the road thing.
It feels like the end of the road, too. That's what I love about it. When you're in Key West, you're like, yeah, I have reached the end of this.
Well, there's also some beautiful, I stayed in a mansion down there, the Curry Mansion Inn, and there's some beautiful places to stay, either hotels or inns or things like that. But again, we're running a little bit out of time. Erik Smith, if I had to ask you to summarize southern Florida in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I'd give you cosmopolitan for Miami.
Yep.
I would give you unique for the Everglades, and I would give you quirky for Key West, because we divided it in 3, and that's perfect.
Excellent. And we have 3 different episodes, again, going back in the archives about these 3 destinations. We've kind of lumped them together here because I think it makes a good trip. It really makes a good combination here to do all 3 together if you have the time. But if you're interested in a little more detail, we do talk about them in 3 different shows separately. Erik, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler and telling and help me tell the story of your love for southern Florida.
A pleasure as always, Chris.
One quick update on the show. After we finished recording it, Erik went to look for that self-guided tour of Art Deco in Miami that he had used and found that blogger had stopped blogging and had taken down their blog. So I do have a reference in the show notes to one, but it's not the same one that he used. Also, I do want to remind you that signups are available for the 2019 trip to Southern Africa, to South Africa, Botswana, and Victoria Falls with Amateur Traveler. Go to amateurtraveler.com/Africa2019 to sign up for that. And then with that, we're going to end this rather long episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more.